Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is Ed West. Ed is a journalist and cultural commentator with a substack called The Wrong Side of History. And I think the title nicely captures his slightly gloomy but extremely witty style. It's one of the UK's most popular substacks, and I don't think it needs any introduction over here in the UK. But for American listeners, I really urge you to seek it out. It's absolutely fantastic.
That's very kind, Russell. Very kind indeed.
It's true.
Lovely words.
And aside from his work as a journalist and substacker, Ed has written a series of mini histories. And it's one of these we're going to talk about today, which is to say his book about the Norman invasion of England, which goes by the title 1066 and Before All That. Anyway, welcome, Ed, to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. This is my second time, I believe.
Yes, this is your second time. So
I'm on the returnees.
Yes, you're on the list of returnees. Okay, so the title of your book, that's a nod to the famous book by Seller and Yeatman called 1066 and All That. And I say it's famous, but I don't know because it's pretty old now. But I think it's well known, certainly still in England. And that book, it's very much a parody and it's very silly, but it does put its finger on things quite well, I think. And as far as the book is concerned, there's only two dates in English history. And one of these is when the Romans first invade in 55 BC, and the other is 1066. So leaving aside 55 BC and the Romans, why is 1066 still such a big deal?
I think even with the decline of kind of general historical literacy, it's still the most well-known date. Apparently, I think it was the most popular code for PIN numbers that people use. It's very easy to remember. And I think for England in particular, it forms the sort of start of our national story in a way that's not really fair because, as you know, I'm a big fan of Alfred the Great, and England became a unified kingdom in 927 and with Athelstan. But with the arrival of Normans, England is brought under the kind of cultural influence of France. It's much bigger and much more important neighbour. And with that come the origins in many ways of our class structure, which is a sort of division between a kind of French influence aristocracy and a sort of Anglo-Saxon peasantry. It completely transforms our language. Old English, if anyone tries to read it, is very, very hard to understand. It's one of the languages that has changed the most in the last 1,000 years or so. It's much more Germanic. And now what we have instead is a language which is a mixture of German and French. And it's been described as probably the most catastrophic defeat for any group in European history, in the sense that the entire English ruling class was completely defeated and many were actually killed at Hastings. But when the Domesday Book was recorded 20 years later, there were only 2 English landholders in the whole of the country. The church was entirely dominated by Normans. And so it created this idea of 2 nations, which Disraeli famously talked about, and which is still alluded to a little bit today. I mean, I mention the example of Harry Potter, the most important cultural book of the last 30 years. It's had such a huge influence. Mm-hmm. But even in that, which is a lot about that English obsession class, the baddies have obviously Norman-sounding names: Malfoy, Voldemort, and the goodies have the quintessential Potter is example of those kind of English surnames which relate to trade and a kind of low status and reflect a kind of Anglo-Saxon heritage. So I think that idea of England as a kind of class-based system really comes back to 1066.
Hmm. So we should also maybe bring in the Normans here, because they seem to be quite remarkable. They conquer England, right? They conquer Sicily. They take Antioch. They invade the Byzantine Empire several times, sometimes with success, sometimes with less success. But so who are the Normans? Because they seem to be an absolute nightmare.
The Normans, they're a fascinating group of people. Their origins go about a century and a half earlier. So the beginning of the 10th century, when the Vikings, the Norsemen, are terrorizing England and France. And when it becomes too hard in France, then they sort of go back to England and vice versa. And eventually, the king of the Franks at this point, as they're still called, just sort of accepts that they are a part. They're part of life now. So he essentially allows them to settle on the coast in what becomes now known as Normandy, around Rouen, which is their capital, which was a very large city in medieval times, and less so now. They are pagans. They originally have the practice of multiple wives, but they very quickly, within the 2 generations or so, become very, very Christian, very Catholic. But this doesn't also stop them being incredibly violent. They're full of stories about, the local bishop who sets fire to a church full of people and commits all sorts of horrible murders and rapes. And this is a complete feature of it. And they have a very extremely violent aristocratic kind of society, which is incredibly competitive. And the thing to understand about France is that, France, we have a sort of, I suppose, an American World War II kind of jokey image of the French always surrounding. France is the opposite. Historically, it's always been the most belligerent country in Europe and the most militaristic. And one of the reasons is it just has the best, most fertile land. North and Western France is incredibly fertile. It's incredibly fought over. And so what emerges is the development of castles all along the west. So Normandy and Anjou to the south are just filled. And if you go to the Loire Valley now, it's full of chateaus. It's lovely. Those chateaus were originally castles, basically. So every local strongman had his castle. Once you had a castle, it was very hard to kind of get rid of you, basically. And at the top of this, the Norman ruling family were also incredibly belligerent. But the thing about Normans is that they're slightly complex, because they were quite thuggish in some ways, and they were also, firstly, incredibly intelligent. They were very, very sophisticated with their battle tactics, and they learned very well. And when they were in the East, as they did spend a lot of their time, they obviously learned a lot from the Byzantines,
right,
in terms of their military technology. And they also developed, along with the Franks generally, a system which became known as chivalry, which was basically when you captured an enemy aristocrat, you ransomed them. There was basically a taboo emerged that you don't kill opponents. You ransom them, you get the money. While in England, they were always killing each other. If you captured a rival, you just killed him, or you plucked his eyes out, or something horrific like that. And so the mixture of this kind of early, slightly romantic ideal with kind of extreme violence. And also they turn up everywhere. So they become very religious. They become very interested in traveling. These pilgrimages begin maybe as far back as the 10th century to the Holy Land, and the Normans are very keen on that. So William the Conqueror's father is known as Robert the Liberal. That obviously not in another sense. Because what it means is he was generous with giving money to the church. He wasn't like into LGBT rights or anything. But he died going to the Holy Land. He came back. He died on the way back from one of the various diseases people die of. But while on one of their trips, those Normans on the way back landed in Sicily, and the locals were fighting a kind of local war, and they said, "Oh, can you help us?" And obviously that was a terrible mistake, because then they come back with loads of them, and then eventually the Normans end up ruling not just Sicily but all of southern Italy, basically, which they conquer variously from the Byzantines and from there are various different groups fighting over that part of the world, because it's a mixture of Catholic, Orthodox, and Muslim, and that makes them very powerful with the church. At one point, they even capture the Pope, so that the church is very scared of them, basically. So that makes them very powerful. And that would have a huge impact when 1066 comes along, because they get the backing of the church, which is terrible news for the English.
But let's talk about the English then. And I don't want to go too far back in English history, because the names just get too confusing. So
many Ethelwigs and various... Yeah.
I was speaking to Mark Morris about Edward I, and we did a podcast on him, and his name comes, of course, because his father was a huge fan of Edward the Confessor, and his point was that, was it not for the fact that Edward I had been brought in and became a hugely popular English name, we would still look on Edward as being this sort of another of these weird and fanciful names like Ethel whatever. But because But because Edward I was so successful, it's sort of become anglicised and become normalised.
And that's why I'm an Edwards, while there aren't many Edwigs out there, or Edwees, or the other ones.
But let's talk about Edward the Confessor then. Well, go back as far as you like.
Yeah, so that's it. That's basically the origin story. Basically, the Vikings had returned back in the 11th century. England had been ruled by a Danish king. He was a pretty effective ruler. So, I mean, England was conquered in 1066, in 1016. This kind of precursor, but it didn't lead to the huge wholesale change. The English ruling class weren't wiped down. Lots of English lords would serve Canute. After Canute dies, he has two sons. This is all very complicated because the polygamy makes things extra complex as well. So Canute had two wives, despite being quite a Christian, and he had two sons by two different wives, and they both ruled for not particularly long periods, and they were barely even worth mentioning. So after the second one dies, basically the last member of the old ruling House of Wessex, the descendant of Alfred the Great, is a guy called Edward, who becomes known as Edward Confessor. And he is the son of Ethelred the Unready by his second wife. He's half Norman. So that's where the problems basically start. So his mother is Emma of Normandy, who's this kind of quite frightening figure who's like very dominant. She marries Ethelred, she marries Canute. Two of her sons, two of her husbands are king. So Edward had been in exile in Normandy. So he comes back in 1042 and he rules England. So the old ruling house is restored. He seems to have a terrible relationship with his mother. He basically puts her on trial eventually. But the problem is there is basically what we now, later call a kind of overmighty lords called Godwin, whose origins are known. We're not entirely sure, but he came to power under Canute. So he worked for Canute basically as a kind of thug, basically. And he had a Danish wife, and he had become the Earl of Wessex. So basically the biggest landholder in the whole of England. So he was a big rival to Edward. Edward hated him for quite good reason, that Godwin had probably killed Edward's brother. There was a kind of earlier botched Norman invasion in which Edward's brother Alfred had turned up, and then Godwin's men arrested him and blinded him, and that killed him. And so those two hate each other. Godwin has 6 sons, and he has a daughter, and his daughter marries Edward the Confessor's daughter, Edith. Everyone seems to be called Edith, so there's another thing. It's the medieval problem of everyone having the same name. So there's this kind of uneasy settlement between Edward and the Godwins.
But just to go back, because you said that Edward grows up in Normandy.
He spends a lot of time in Normandy, yeah. He goes there for exile for a lot of the time when Canute's in power.
And is that part of the problem as to why the Normans think they've got some kind of a stake in England? Is the genesis of that in Edward's time in Normandy?
It's because Edward's mother was the sister of the Duke of Normandy. Then that was basically a political alliance to sort of counter the influence of the Vikings. And so, yes, William would be the great nephew of Edward in that case, the great nephew of Emma. So he would use that connection as one of his. I mean, I should say, generally, I think William's claim to the throne is very, very dubious, if not non-existent. But you can't really argue with a man like that. So what can you do?
So he, so Edward, he has a miserable time. Well, he's been exiled, and then he comes back, and as you say, he's got the problem of all these overmighty lords.
Yeah, so Godwin in particular. So he has to marry Godwin's daughter. They don't produce children. No one's entirely sure why, and it's probably impossible to speculate. Edward seems to be a very holy figure. I mean, we don't know. Maybe he didn't consummate the marriage because he didn't want to form a dynasty. And so at some point, the Godwins are exiled because they have a kind of conflict with the king. And so Godwin has 6 sons. The oldest is Sven. He sounds like he's a bit of a wrong un. He probably rapes a nun. He's exiled. Then he comes back, and I think he killed one of his cousins, and he eventually dies. And so the next eldest son is Harold Godwinson, who is to become the kind of hero of the story. Harold, I mean, what we know about him is that he was supposedly very good looking. He was very adept and very effective. He, both militarily and I suppose one would say politically. So as Edward gets older and he comes closer to his death, Harold is He's in his 30s. He's at the height of his power. Everyone that basically respects him as the most powerful leader in England. He has no royal blood, but that's not necessarily the end of the world, because under the Anglo-Saxons, the king was basically appointed by the leading elders of the state. It wasn't automatically hereditary. It wasn't passed on. So whoever was the most, you had to be sort of throne worthy.
Mm.
The problem is there weren't really any real royals left in the House of Wessex. So to make things another complicated,
No.
Edward had a nephew who was out in Hungary, and he got called back. So he came all the way back from Hungary. It took him a year, and then as soon as he got to England, he died within like 3 days or something. Which no one's entirely sure. Well, it could just be people died of things. Could have been things. So he's got a son called Edgar, but Edgar's only 13 in 1066. He's still a child. He technically becomes king after Harold, but he's not recognised as the regular thing. So basically, the options are when Edward is dying, Harold is basically appointed king, and there's one person. Well, there's actually two people to make it worse. There are two people who are very upset about that. Foreign rulers who believe they have been promised in some way the kingdom of England.
Well, I was going to come on to that, because had Harold not visited Normandy and got into some sort of a entanglement with William and the Normans, and is that not part of why? Well,
Right.
Is it like why William claims he's got?
This is why William claimed it. So in 1064, 2 years before he becomes king, Harold went to Normandy. We're not entirely sure why. He had gone to France. One theory is that his youngest brother, who has like one of the most unfortunate roles in the story, now he will spend all his life imprisoned by the Normans. He had been sent over basically as a hostage in the earlier dispute with the Godwins. He was still there. So the most likely story is Harold had gone over there to try to get him back. He had been captured by a sort of local lords. William had, as the overlords had said, he's mine. The two men went hunting together, and then they fought together against local rivals. And you can see in the tapestry, Bayeux tapestry, that Harold's pulling a Norman knight out of quicksand. Like, Harold is supposed to be incredibly strong. He fought very well, and by all accounts, the two men did get on. They they were both very strong, kind of false figures. I mean, that's probably the only bit that's accurate in the new TV series, although they for some reason they completely change it so they meet in England. But they did meet in 1064, and at that point Harold was supposed to have promised the kingdom to William when Edward dies. The story has that he made this promise, and then the Normans, they sort of take away a piece of cloth, and underneath it are some saints' bones, which makes the promise sacred.
Oh, I see. So the idea is that he sort of swears on a piece of cloth, and then there's relics underneath the cloth.
I suppose to later, certainly from a theological point of view, later observers will say, well, that makes it invalid because he didn't know. But the Normans presented this as, oh, we're so clever, we've tricked him into making this oath. And this just shows how devious and clever we are.
And this is shown, I think, in the Bayeux tapestry, is that right?
Yes, it is. That's William's basically rationale for it.
But hang on, let's leave the relics to one side. If he does swear an oath, are oaths not supposed to be something that you give before God, irrespective of whether or not somebody's hidden, a saint's, fingernail under the cloth?
I think I suppose it adds added legal weight in the thinking of the time.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of irrelevant though, because whether William knew this or not, is the Witan basically decides who's king. So even if Harold says, I think this French bloke should be king,
yeah,
they're just going to say no, because no one would want a foreigner ruling them. I mean, that's kind of a universal rule in most of the situations at the time. They just wanted an Englishman to rule them because they didn't know this guy. He doesn't speak English. He's from across the sea. He's a complete stranger to the island, which makes the whole invasion plan so bizarre in retrospect. It seems so reckless and so ambitious, which is so typical of the Normans as a people. That they weren't seafaring people particularly, even though they're Vikings in origin. They were land fighters. They were very good at land war, but they weren't. The Norman lords were very anxious about going over the sea, and it's a very dangerous stretch of water. And in later centuries, loads of Anglo-Norman lords would be killed trying to cross that stretch of water. It's very hazardous. And William himself had such, he was duke from a very early age after his father died. So he had multiple attempts in his life. He had a very, very difficult upbringing. He's constantly under danger from his father's relatives. He had so much on his plate But he decided, he wanted to be a king, and that would make him, and partly his rivalry with the King of France, his overlord, this would make him an equal to the King of France in some ways. And so the bold idea came into his head, and they succeeded.
So you said there were two people who were sort of looking for the throne. So I guess William is one of them. Who was the other?
No, the other's Harald Hadrada, he's a fantastic figure because he's sort of like the lion. He's the last Viking, basically. After he dies, it's all just sort of, human rights and ABBA and furniture from the Scandinavians. It's something obviously happens. So he had lived a remarkable life. At the age of 15, he'd been his half brother had been killed in a battle. He had just escaped, hiding out in the woods in the winter. He'd gone to Constantinople, and there are loads of stories attached to him. And I think most of them probably aren't true, but he was obviously a very frightening and incredible. He was that very tall and obviously very, very charismatic. He led kind of basically Viking mercenaries out in Constantinople, where there was a long running connection between the Norsemen down through what is now Russia and Ukraine towards Constantinople, where they worked as kind of tough guys. And he spent many years there, and he's apparently fought a dragon and blah 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 and all these kind of stories. And then he came back to Norway to be. He shared the throne, and then he became the sole ruler, and he became known as a hard ruler because he's, if you came to him complaining about taxes, he'll sort of cut your head off. And even by the standards of the time, he was known as a very ferocious ruler. But he also had this Viking obsession with poetry and of being remembered as a great warrior. And it's almost like there's a certain sort of death wish element to this, that he thought, this is a bit of a mad idea. I'm going to invade England.
But it isn't his idea, is it? I mean, it comes from somebody else.
It's a long-running, under the Canute, England and Norway were joined, basically, and there was kind of agreement with his nephew and one of the English kings that whoever dies first, the other person gets to rule both kingdoms. But it was almost like one of these kind of forgotten promises, like no one would...
Right.
You just say that, it's not going to happen. Already at this stage, understand is that England had been under the sway of Scandinavian influence for a long time. It'd been ruled by Scandinavians. Much of the population was essentially Scandinavian, but that was already starting to change.
This is the bit of the story I always find confusing, because we all remember Alfred the Great, and he's the guy who defeats the Vikings. And yet, hang on, we've got Canute, we've got others who say, hang on, there's Vikings everywhere.
Yeah, they come back. What happens is the Vikings basically become Christianized, and that kind of makes them worse in many ways, because they now have, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were one of the earliest countries to have state formation, along with England and France. And so during the second Viking invasion becomes more of a problem, because all these states, that they've become proper states now rather than sort of mini earldoms, and they can then have much bigger armies, and they're much more effective. So Canute could call all of Denmark for that reason, and Norway. So they are becoming much more like real countries rather than kind of the original Vikings were just kind of roving bands of kind of extra surplus men who were causing trouble. But you have to understand also that huge parts of eastern England are still basically Viking. So Harald Hadrada thinks that if he's told to make it extra complicated, so by this point Harold's younger brother, his next youngest brother Tostig, he's fallen out with him.
Now, this is where it gets very difficult, because we got Harald and we got Harold. And so this is the English Harold's brother, Tostig, has fallen out with him.
Harold still has 4 brothers left, and the next one was Tostig, and he was appointed the Earl of the North and Northumbria, but he was basically chased out. I mean, they hated him there for some reason. I mean, he comes across as a bit of an unhinged figure and a bit too brutal, so he was driven out, and Harold Godwinson made a deal with the kind of ruling aristocracy of Northumbria to back him. It was Edwin and Morcar, they're called, who are still quite young, and he marries their sister. He already has a bride, and they all called Edith, and it's all very complicated. So Tostig is outraged by this. He flees the country, gets his revenge. He goes around all of Northwest Europe saying, I'm really popular in England. Come with me and we'll invade it. And either I become king or you become king or whatever. And everyone says no. They know he's probably not very popular. He's actually quite a weak figure. But he gets as far as Norway, and Harold says, that's a great idea. And one theory is that Norway is so far away, he probably wasn't aware of the local politics. And so Tostig convinces him to invade. So he he then, does the kind of trip where they go around, they go via Orkney. And bear in mind, all these islands like the Orkney, the Shetlands, they're all Viking at this point. So he can stop along the way, sing a few songs, have a piss up, recruit more men, and he just moves down the east coast of England, where he invades in Yorkshire. And that's the first invasion of the year. So he arrives in Yorkshire with Tostig, and Tostig says, everyone really loves me, it's great. They go to York, and no one comes up, and no one talks to Tostig. And it's actually, everyone really hates me. So they defeat a sort of very ragtag English army at Fulford, the first battle of the year. Edwin and Morcar defeated. Meanwhile, in the south, the English army has been spent the whole of the sort of summer, late summer, guarding the south coast, expecting a Norman invasion, because they know a Norman invasion is coming, but they have to get back to their crops for the harvest. So it's a big problem with when you have a kind of citizen farmer army like that. So eventually they go back. Harold says, all right, it's too late in the year. Harold Godwinson, too late in the year. The Normans aren't going to invade now. So the men are released, and then he hears news. Oh no, the Vikings have invaded. So he raises an army. It's always been a mystery how he manages to do it so quickly, because he basically gets there in 4 or 5 days, much quicker than Harald Hadrada expected. We're not entirely sure how he did it. He might have raised more men in the north than we previously arrived. So he arrives in Yorkshire, and then there is this kind of set piece where he talks to his brother. And again, this does sound a bit too convenient a story. It's
the whole of history.
Yes, I mean, it's the thing about 1066 is this is what annoys me about the recent drama, is it's the actual story is so amazing. It's got so many plot twists and so many turns and so many great characters that I don't know why you'd want to change that at all, because you can't make up something that's better than this. So at this point, before the meeting, the English army arrives and they kind of parley, and Tostig says, well, what are you going to give my friend Harald Hadrada? He says, we'll give him 6 feet of English soil, i.e. a grave. Or he says, well, he's a big man, so maybe 7 foot. So the English and the Viking invaders, the second battle happens, Battle of Stamford Bridge, just outside York. And the English win. Harold is killed, Tostig is killed. Harold, apparently, according to, as he's sort of bleeding, like the blood's pouring out of his mouth, he's, his last breath, he says, oh, it's time for one last poem. I'm not sure if it's probably true. Let's let it be said, I killed 1,000 men in battle, blah, blah, and then he's dead. And then...
Hang on. How do the English, because the Vikings are terrifying in battle. Is the English army bigger? Is it luckier? Is it better led? Why does...
We just had God on our sides. I think that's just the obvious explanation.
he swapped sides quickly.
I mean, Harold had a long history. He had lots of military experience. He fought extensively in Wales. He was just a very good leader. So after the battle, there are 300 Viking ships turned up. There are only enough men for 30. Harold Godwinson, in a remarkable gesture, really, he allows the Viking survivors to go home unmolested. He allows Harold's son to go home. He says, I'm not going to kill and enslave you. And that actually, much later, that will have a kind of small bearing on his successors. So they start to head home, and he thinks, okay, by now it's late September. And then they hear the disastrous news. 28th of September, the Normans have arrived in England, in Sussex. The wind had turned. William arrived. There's a story that along the way, his clairvoyant drowns. And he makes a joke, well, he wasn't very clairvoyant, was he?
So they used to carry fortune tellers with them, even though they're nominally Christian.
Oh, yeah,
I like it.
They still had lots of they had some remnants of the pagan past. But the thing about the Normans is they were essentially basically French. I think the Viking element's probably slightly overplayed. The actual Viking, the originators, the Viking population were very small in number. They had only a few loan words. They weren't basically French. Although, William the Conqueror, he would have been called like something more like Wilhelm than Guillaume. So, there was a slight, it's a kind of complex mix. So he arrives basically in Harold's own county, Sussex. And they do what the Normans always do. They just start burning out villages, attacking locals.
Hang on. I want to go back a bit because you mentioned somehow they've managed to get the Pope's blessing. So number one question is, what on earth has it got to do with the Pope?
Well, this comes down to, I mean, how much do you want to talk about ecclesiastical politics in the 11th century? I mean, I've got all day.
That's lucky. We might need
Basic,
it.
Basically, so this is Tom Holland thoughts here. So there was a huge kind of change going on in the Catholic Church at the time in the 11th century. It was called Reformation originally. It was becoming much stricter about lots of things like priestly celibacy. The church was pretty corrupt before that. It was called the pornocracy in the 9th and 10th century. It was kind of very common for bishops and priests to have children, sometimes openly married. They would hold multiple offices. There was this kind of purify movement, and the English were quite bad at this. Like a lot of their leading churchmen are pretty corrupt, and the worst of them was a guy called Stigand, who was kind of an Harold. He was Harold's ally. He was an ally of the Godwins, and also England is now as in then it is kind of isolated in Europe in many ways. The Normans were Italians and French were very influential in it, and as I say, a previous pope had basically been captured by the Normans, so they were very scared of them, and they wanted them on side. But there was also a sense that the church in England had become pretty corrupt. So the Pope basically gives a papal blessing to William, which means anyone can join the fight. So all sorts of lords from all over. There are lots of Bretons. There were lots of sort of Flemings. There were even some Italians. There were soldiers coming from all over the place. Because once you give the church's blessing, everyone kind of joins in. As was happened in the Crusades, which is absolutely disastrous news for Harold and these lords, they expect something in return. They expect land.
But I still can't quite get over it. I mean, you've made the point, like the English Channel can be pretty hard to cross, particularly in winter when you get a storm, you can just all be killed. So he gets these lords, but they must be pretty desperate to be invading, across the sea, a kingdom like England, which is presumably, which we know is no pushover. So how does he persuade them to come? I mean, it just seems, papal blessing or no papal blessing, it seems amazing he can get an army together.
One of the biggest drivers, especially of Norman expansion, was the younger son's problem. The Norman knight who conquered, William Strongarm, who conquered Sicily, if I'm getting this correct, he had 12 sons. Your eldest son inherits the lands. Your second son maybe joins the church. What are you going to do with all these other sons? A lot of warfare in medieval Europe was driven by excess aristocratic young men whose only training had been in violence and who had nothing else to do but start wars. I mean, the Crusades were, in fact, a way of kind of relieving that violent impulse. And, the idea was that send them to the east and they might conquer or they get killed. But either way, it's not a problem anymore.
Job done.
Yeah, so this is a time when, everyone is basically close to the edge of starvation. The desire for land is absolutely a driver for many people. The problem is for William, his original idea was, well, I'll be proclaimed king and I'll rule as their king. But as he makes more promises to all these other aristocrats who are coming with him, it's clear that he has to take the land from the English. He's not coming to just be the king. He is going to take away their lands and basically reduce them to, serfdom, whatever. So by that stage, this is just a very, very hostile army. And the thing about England had a very, very sophisticated state system. Its tax-raising powers were very, very advanced. It was actually very culturally advanced in terms of its kind of vernacular literature. The Vikings raided it because they always had money to give them. So that was the attraction. But they're also militarily much less advanced than the French. And this comes down to the idea that France was full of all these competing dukedoms, duchies, and such like, who were constantly at war with each other. And that led to basically an arms escalation. The Norman cavalry was way more effective than anything the English had. The English didn't even fight on horses. They rode the horses to battle. They fought in infantry. Their archery was much less advanced than the Normans. So the Norman aristocracy, unlike that in England, they had an entire basically warrior caste whose entire purpose, all they did all day was basically prepare for war. And the cavalry, which was what won the war, basically, that was a very complicated system that required a huge amount of training and huge amounts of coordination between men and horseback. And it's very hard to fight on horseback in a war like that. For a start, the horses get scared. And the Normans even bred a particularly aggressive type of horse, which would sometimes bite people in battle, which was better equipped to kind of deal with the stress of the whole thing. It just shows that they were hard not to admire how driven they were to kind of do all this. In that sense, invading another country, yes, that's a huge risk. The advantage is always with the defenders, but they were a terrifying kind of group of people to have. I mean, it's the last people you want invading you in the 11th century, basically.
I was speaking to Lord Sumption about the Hundred Years' War, and he said that one of the key English tactics which allowed them to win battle after a battle was that they dismounted from their horses and fought, and that it was only once the French started copying them. Well, actually, there were two things that the English did, was that they stood on the defensive and let the French come at them, and that they had dismounted from their horses. And so it seems that something. Well, I suppose the English then had great archery, which which you're saying they didn't have at the Battle of Hastings. But it's quite interesting that in the 100 Years' War the cavalry was not the decisive arm. But you're saying, we may as well talk about the battle. You're saying that at Hastings the cavalry is the decisive arm.
I mean, obviously war evolves a huge amount between the 11th and the 14th century. By the 14th century, like the crossbows had come, and then the longbows in the 14th century. And if you had a longbow formation, then you could fire. I can't remember. This is obviously slightly irrelevant, but the number of arrows the English were firing at Crécy and Poitiers was just enormous, and no amount of prancing around on cavalry could kind of do much about that. But in this earlier stage, the English and Vikings would just fight hand to hand in very close kind of combat, like a big rugby scrum. But once you have the Norman development of cavalry, which involved much more sophisticated, they had developed a particular type of lance that was completely out of the depths of any kind of infantryman. It wasn't just cavalry, but also, what finally did it on the actual day was, they also developed things, like the fake retreats, which was one reason they did it. They were able to coordinate in a way that the English just weren't. I mean, and that's why basically, the Normans kind of won pretty much every battle they fought, really.
But the battle itself, I think I saw somewhere that the Normans lose 2,500 men and the English lose 4,000 men. So that's a pretty hard fought battle. And it's not like the usual thing where one side takes all the casualties. I mean, it must have been pretty grisly on both sides.
What's interesting about Hastings is that, as the medieval historians always say, battles are very rare. I mean, most fighting was basically you besiege a castle and hopefully they'll starve to death before you'll starve to death or whatever. No one really liked, if you fought a battle, anything can go wrong. And it's like, if your king gets killed, stray arrow, as maybe happens, we don't actually know that's true, then, everything's over. You've lost everything. So it's such a huge gamble. So that's why, Hastings was huge and unusual. Probably like 9,000 men on each side, roughly. And, starting at the beginning of the day, going on till the very end of the day, basically. And the essential point of it was, firstly, Harold dies. Most people, I suppose, think the arrow in the eye is probably a bit of a kind of just so story. It's just as plausible that a sort of crack team of William's men had kind of basically hunted him down and managed to kill him. Both his brothers die. And then, the Norman line starts to break. The Normans are going up a hill, which even, I'm not a military historian, military expert anyway. But obviously, if you're on the top of the hill, you have an advantage. And so the Normans are kind of trying to push up the hill. And then one of their lines starts to break a little bit. And then they notice that the English start running down from them. So they actually coordinate a fake retreat. And when you do a fake retreat, you can basically draw, the English break their lines. And that makes it easier to basically kind of like take them all on. And that kind of proves to be a crucial kind of error for the English. And the feigned retreat is a tactic that, again, was probably brought back from Byzantium, as was the castle building. They learned a lot from their experiences of fighting different people. And that proved fatal. I mean, like, Harold, in retrospect, it was very unwise. His mother had advised him, send one of your brothers. You've got two brothers left to fight with you. Both of them die. Send one of your brothers, stay back, and if he gets killed, you're still the king. And that would have been much more sensible advice, because even if William wins that battle, he's still surrounded by a totally hostile population, and he still has to get them to submit. So as long as there is a figurehead resisting them, they've really got no hope, because there are a few thousand men in a country with 1 million or maybe 2 million people who all hate them. And as if anything happens to William, then the whole thing's over. And in fact, after the Battle of Hastings, they They move east towards Kent, and at that point, William actually falls sick, dysentery, and dysentery killed loads of people in that period. Henry V famously died of it. So he might have died, and the whole thing might have been for absolutely nothing. And in which case, there would have been no Norman conquest anyway, because those soldiers with him, I mean, they would just have to fight their way out of the country. But by this point, there's basically no leadership left. So he goes from town to town, burning everything. In London, which is then is now the biggest city, the kind of local leadership say, well, Edgar is the rightful king, we'll proclaim him. But he's 13 and he can't do anything about it, really. And so eventually they go out to Wallingford and they submit to William and say, you're the king. And so he's won. I mean,
it does seem like he was incredibly lucky then, because if Harold chooses not to lead from the front, or if he decides to withdraw quicker than he does,
there's so many. I mean, it's reckless in the sense that, and also Harold could have waited until, if he waited a little while, he could have got a much bigger army and changed the odds. But the argument is that they were attacking his own county, and he's the local lord, and that is a sort of direct challenge to him. I mean, that's the thing. In which case, it seems very impetuous. He's already won one battle. He's killed like the biggest Viking, yeah. leader of the age. He's already done enough for a year, and then foolishly, so on October the 14th, it's basically, it all ends for Anglo-Saxon England. People don't realize it at the time, but that's what's going to happen. William is installed king on Christmas Day. It's Westminster Abbey, which is Edward's great project. And in the subsequent months and years, the Anglo-Saxon, the 5,000 strong upper class, they are all disinherited. Anyone who even fought at Hastings has their land taken away. The Normans just take away huge amounts of land. William's two half-brothers, they're given kind of land in 20 or 25 different counties. About 25% of the land goes to the crown and another 25 to the church. And I think basically most of the rest goes to the Norman aristocracy. The whole of Essex is turned into crown lands. As New Forests becomes, a sort of playground for the Normans. It's complete disastrous for the natives. And there's no other way of putting it. It's a catastrophe for them, because they've, they now find themselves totally reduced.
I suppose their only role then becomes to provide brides for the conquerors, and then eventually, the populations assimilate together just through marriage, I guess.
There are obviously lots of examples of that. William's own son, Henry, who becomes Henry I, he married Edgar's, confused, is it a niece or sister? But he marries a woman from the old House of Wessex. And so within a couple of generations, by the time of sort of Henry II, the kings of England have the old Anglo-Saxon ruling house blood in their veins. And by the 12th century, by the end of the 12th century, people say, it's basically impossible to determine if someone is a Saxon or Norman anymore. It's too ambiguous. Originally there were explicit sort of, I suppose you could call it sort of apartheid style laws, in which if a Norman was murdered in a village, the whole village would be punished in some way. And because there was obviously a sense and a fear that given the chance that the natives would just kill the Normans they could, but which is why the new rulers started establishing castles up and down the country. There were some very basic castles before them, but it was basically, they were of a much more sort of feeble construction. They built the Tower of London, they built, Newcastle, they dozens and dozens of these kind of fortresses, because if you have a castle, then it's very hard for the kind of native population to rebel against you in any way. And William becomes more and more oppressive, basically, as he tries to learn English, but he gives up. The locals, they all hate him. There are kind of mini uprisings, and then in 1069, it completely explodes in the north. The local people kill the local Normans, revolt against them, and invite the Danes to come over, because the people in Yorkshire are kind of very, very related. They still see themselves as sort of Viking. This is, mercilessly put down by William. The harrowing of the north is probably considered his greatest crime. I mean, probably about 200,000 people died as a result, maybe.
Dear God, that's out of a population of what? I mean, in the north, a population of what? 1 million at most?
That's probably the upper figure, but there was widespread starvation. It was it was sort of like a terror famine of its time. They destroyed all the crops and the population was starved. And the north and that part of the country took a long time to recover. And after that, it was There's no other way of describing it. It was just basically rule by terror. But on the other hand, and Mark Morris, who's very, I would say, he's quite pro-Norman, I suppose. He points to it's much more complicated than that because in some ways the Normans were, dare I say, progressive. They were, they abolished slavery. Anglo-Saxon England, about 10% of the population at least were slaves. The Normans disliked slavery for religious reasons. The church was very much turning against slavery. You couldn't enslave another Christian, and the Normans abolished it. Their system of chivalry was introduced into England, so politics became much less violent.
But is chivalry less violent? I always thought it was an excuse for thugs to beat up peasants. I mean, am I?
Well, chivalry evolves. Obviously, it's hard to shake out the 19th century idea of chivalry, which is associated with sort of gentleness towards women and children. But it does become much more like that as the medieval period. It starts off as basically a way you don't kill aristocrats in battle. You can kill the peasants. Who cares about them? But it basically installs a series of rules about war, which will remain in. William had one aristocrat executed at his time, and he had rebelled against him like 3 times. He was really asking for it. William was very, very. He was actually quite against capital punishment. He was very sparing and used it, and that taboo against executing aristocrats that holds up until Edward I for over 200 years. It never happens. The problem with all taboos is that once you break it, everyone starts breaking it. And what Edward I, once he starts doing it, that eventually leads to the War of the Roses, where the cry of the leadership is that kill the noblemen, spare the peasants. That becomes like the opposite. But under William, there was a certain, civilizing is the wrong word, but it was some of these ideas we associate with courtliness do become much more installed. Anglo-Saxon England was a bit rough and ready in many ways. And it's impossible to separate this from the basic kind of French influence on England, which then becomes very pronounced. And I think still shapes English identity so much. English class attitudes, class ideas are so entwined with our idea of France. The English middle class love France, the English working class hate them traditionally. And French ideas, French words, all the words in the legal system, in governments, they're all from French. France signifies government, order, sophistication. It's another kind of form of Latinization of England. And it profoundly changes the country in so many ways, and including, I don't want to sound like a sort of heartless libertarian here, but there is a lot of...
You are a heartless libertarian. What are you talking about?
I don't want to reveal myself too much here, but there is a lot of economic growth under the Normans. There is substantial evidence there's a big increase in trade with the continent. It brings us into the economic as well as the cultural sphere of France and the Low Country and much more. Having said that, that was going to happen anyway, I think, eventually, because just France had such a big...
Right.
France was so important. Its population was 5 times as big as England back then. And we were bound to start. And in fact, I've written about this before, but many English loanwords from French already arrived before the Norman conquest.
Right.
Words like bacon and ginger, and there were like dozens of words, and it kind of continues. But the Norman conquest basically accelerates that. There's funny study, even if this century, people with Norman surnames are still wealthier by some degree than people with sort of Old English surnames. And I think as far as the 19th century, people with Norman surnames were like 8 times more likely to be members of Parliament. The interesting thing about the 100 Years' War was that the English army, which basically devastated France, just kind of, especially Normandy, was very Anglo-Norman in structure. The army remained very Anglo-Norman. They are sort of a kind of warrior caste, which can be seen in British military history, right up until the 19th century. Sort of Lord Cardigan is the kind of Crimea fame was from a kind of old Anglo-Norman family. Montgomery, who conquered France in 1944, come from a Norman family. So there is that kind of sense that they, from 1066 to sort of like rugger-buggers, there's that kind of continuity within the English caste system.
And I think English politicians, they all like to sort of look back to the sort of the Anglo-Saxon side of things. It's sort of the almost the mythologizing.
Oh, that's a long. The 17th century, there was constant refrain to that. It was very influential amongst the more radical elements in the parliamentarian cause. The American revolutionaries were very, again, influenced by that. Thomas Jefferson, he believed that the Saxons had this sort of parliament, proto-parliament, the Witan. It wasn't really a parliament, and the Normans stopped this, and he was the kind of continuation of the. You wanted to have Horsa and Hengist, the Anglo-Saxon founders, as statues of them in Congress. So I mean, that had that myth, and it is a myth because if you were at the bottom of Anglo-Saxon slave society, life was miserable. In fact, there are even one or two chronicles who record how English peasants under the Normans, one or two of them at least, said, "Well, we're actually treated better by the Normans than we were by our own people." So there is a lot of myth attached, but it's a powerful myth. That's why I think the story is so interesting, because it's so essential to our sense of kind of national identity. It's why it's still remembered in the way that much else of history, in the way that Alfred the Great isn't, for example, or the later medieval conflicts, which also helped form national identity to a certain extent.
I mean, I suppose the thing I think about 1066, and we've already said it, which is that it's so much a branching of the path. It could easily have gone the other way, and there's no reason to suppose the Normans would have been back next year. Whereas you take something like Constantinople, the fall of Constantinople, where I think the Greeks still lament it, and every year.
Don't we all?
Don't we all? But there's a sense of inevitability about it by that stage.
Yeah.
Whereas there's no sense of inevitability about the Battle of Hastings.
No, it was a complete coin toss. If Harold had followed his mother's advice, which the lesson for all men, even if his brother had been killed, if he'd raised another army, I just find it would be very hard for William to win again, and the Normans would just have been so up against it at that point. And if their duke was killed, it's very unlikely that his successor Robert wasn't much. None of his successors. I mean, his youngest son Henry, but he hadn't been born yet, so he wouldn't have been around. They weren't anything like him in terms of he was an unusual, scary, determined, very effective guy, and I don't think anyone else would have done that. It's a fascinating thing to ponder how things would have turned out, because of course England's relationship with the Celtic nations is very much formed by the Normans, because the Normans,
right.
The Normans aren't going to say, "We've got England, we're going to stay there." They're just, there's somewhere else to invade. We're going to do it. So they accelerate the colonization of Wales to a huge degree. So, they set up basically a 3-part kind of racial system in Wales, with the Normans at the top and the English in the middle and the Welsh at the bottom, which, I mean, even today, if you look at voting patterns in Wales, they match Norman settlement, which I find interesting. And obviously, the Normans in Scotland are a bit more complicated because they're sort of invited in there, which is, in retrospect, seems like a mad idea. But the Stuarts and the Bruces, they were originally Norman. They wasn't so bloody, but the Norman conquest of Ireland had huge tragic consequences for everyone. So again, because England has just such a bigger population compared to the other countries in the Isles, maybe that would happen anyway. It depends about whether you believe how much of these things are inevitable. Obviously Constantinople was totally on its knees by the end. There is no way it does not get conquered by the Ottomans. But yes, this could have gone the other way completely.
Okay, well, I guess we can leave it there. So, Ed West, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
I think that went rather well.
Yeah, that's good. That's really fun. I love talking about Harold.